Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Triple N Media. I am Dr. NIK NIKAM and today we are going to look at what is the best SD card for Nikon D7200 camera. That depends upon what kind of pictures you are trying to take, how you are trying to store them. So in order to understand that, let's look at the misery of choices we got here. First of all, what do all these SD cards mean? What does 64 gigabyte mean? What does SDXC mean? What does 70 megabytes per second mean? So we're going to decipher all these things and come up with a simple solution based on what our particular needs are so that we can select the most appropriate SD card for a given occasion, be it taking family pictures, or you going on a vacation, you want to collect a lot of pictures, or you are a professional photographer doing a wedding photography which involves thousands of images. Do you shoot single image? Do you shoot duplicate images? All of these things have to be taken into consideration before you can select the SD card. So let's do some math. Here's a Nikon D7200. The JPEG image, which is 24 megapixels, takes up 15 megabytes. If you shoot fine JPEG and RAW, each image is 45 megabytes. Now let's say that you want to write to both cards. As you know, D7200 has two SD card slides and you can write to both of them so that one of them will serve as a backup. So if you're shooting simply JPEGs, then it's going to have to store 30 megabytes for each image. Let's keep that in mind. But if you're shooting RAW and JPEG, it has to store 90 megabytes of information to the card per each picture. That's where the speed at which the SD card can write comes into play. Okay, let's look at the memory size of the card and determine how many pictures it can store. If you have a 16 gigabyte SD card, it can store 900 JPEG images, but if you're shooting RAW, it can only store one third of that, and that is 300 images. Similarly, a 32 gigabyte can store 1700 JPEG images and only approximately less than 600 RAW and JPEG images, which are 45 megabytes each. Whereas if you got a 64 gigabyte SD card, which can store 3700 JPEG images and only about approximately less than 300 RAW and JPEG images. So it depends upon what is your final estimation of how many pictures you want to store, and do you want to store them as duplicate images. So if you are aiming for shooting 500 images and you want to duplicate those images, then you're going to need two SD cards which are 32 gigabytes so that you can store images on both SD cards. Whereas if you're shooting only 300 images and if you're just shooting JPEG, you can easily get by with 16 gigabyte SD cards in two slots and make duplicate copies up to 900 images each. So this is how we calculate. But if you are shooting thousands of images, like if you are a wedding photographer, definitely you will need two 64 gigabyte SD cards in two slots. Then you shoot duplicate images, and that will only give you about 37 images. But remember, it's going to take longer time to write 90 megabytes of information to both SD cards. Keeping that in mind, let's look at some of the examples. This was taken from Google Images, and now let's look at in depth what all these numbers mean. 64 gigabyte, that is the storage capacity of the SD card. Now we have the SDXC, which is a much faster technology compared to SDHC. So you want to get a card, preferably SDXC, and make sure that your camera can handle SDXC cards, because some of the older cameras may not be able to handle these kind of cards. Next, you look at the speed. If you are shooting RAW plus JPEG images, you want something which has a pretty fast speed, 95 megabytes per second. That means it will probably be able to store one image per second. But if you are shooting 6 images per second, there is going to be a delay. The images are going to be stored in a temporary buffer and then it's going to be transferred, but then there may be a lag before you can take the next picture. Obviously, the older models like the SDHC are much cheaper, like $7 for a 16 gigabyte, and for same thing 8 gigabytes. Now let's move on to, of course, this 64 gigabyte 95 SDXC may be the type of card that you want to use if you're shooting close to 500 to 1000 pictures, and if you're making duplicate copies on 2 SD cards, especially if you're doing professional photography like a wedding ceremony or an important event, then you need to have a card of this caliber that can accommodate up to 3700 pictures on 2 separate cards. Now let's look at a different scenario here, and this is something which writes at 150 megabytes per second, and again it's a 64 gigabytes SDXC technology. So this is much faster than the one we saw in the previous one, but look at the price tag here, $89 versus $36. So you have to decide how fast you're taking pictures and how quickly your camera can store them on both cards. If you're making duplicate copies, then you will be able to determine what is the best SD card for your camera for that given particular job. Similarly, we have another SD card which is 128 gigabyte. Talking about gigabytes, this is 64 gigabyte, this is 128 gigabytes. If something goes wrong with a 128 gigabyte SD card, then you have to trash it. That means you have to shell off $180. So you're better off to have a 64 or 32 gigabyte SD cards, multiple copies. So many times it happens, I take the card from the camera, I put it into the computer to download the images, then I forget it. Next time I'm in a rush to go and do another project, then I realize I don't have an SD card in the camera. It happens so many times. So that's why you need to have multiple SD cards, at least half a dozen, and you make sure that you have them in your pocket so that you have extra cards in your pocket in addition to the SD cards you have in your camera, both the slots, so that you never run out of an SD card in the middle of your shoot. That's why I think, putting 180 times 2, that's $360, may be a pretty big expense. You may be better off to get 2 64 SD cards or maybe 4 64 SD cards, so that if one of them goes wrong, you still have the other 3 which can function normally. And here is a low end of the SD cards, which is again 16 gigabytes. We can't see, the speed is 80 megabytes per second. So if you're doing like a small graduation or a birthday and you have time to take pictures, a 16 gigabyte SD card can be more than adequate because it can take up to 800 pictures, and if you write both of them, you can still shoot at least 2 pictures per second. So that's a good way to go. So I would stick with the SD cards which have a speed of greater than 80 to 90 megabytes per second, because speed is important if you're trying to capture images in a quick succession. If you are looking for the low budget SD card, this may be an option which has 32 gigabytes, which can give you 1700 pictures at a speed of 80 megabytes per second. That is, if you're just basically storing JPEG images which are 15 megabytes, so you get a fairly fast image storage, and this may very much serve your purpose, and the price is right. So you can put 2 SD cards like this for routine ordinary functions and still come up as a winner, because you have all the images plus you also have a backup copy. So ladies and gentlemen, the best way to select the SD card depends upon the camera, the speed at which the camera writes the images to the SD cards, whether you want single or duplicate images on both cards, and whether you want to store them as JPEG or raw images plus JPEG, And all of these factors to be taken into consideration, and the type of job you're doing. If it's a pretty serious job, you want a high grade SD card, and you want to have smaller size multiple SD cards so that you are not caught off guard in the middle of a function. Thank you so much for your time, and please do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you next time.